This is the story of how my neighbor thought he could solve his leaf raking problem with a chainsaw, and how that decision ended up costing him his fence, his money, and a good chunk of his sanity. My name is Derek. I was 41 when this happened, a project manager for a commercial construction company, married to my wife Valerie for 12 years, father to 2 kids who were 9 and 7 at the time. We'd bought our house 8 years earlier, a nice 4-bedroom colonial on a half-acre lot, in a subdivision that was old enough to have mature trees, but new enough to still have decent plumbing. The oak tree in question stood near the back corner of our property, maybe 15 feet from the property line. It had been there when we bought the house, and according to the previous owners, it had been planted by the original family who built the place back in the early 2000s. 20-plus years of growth had turned it into a genuinely impressive tree, thick trunk, wide canopy, the kind of shade that made summer barbecues actually enjoyable. My kids had a tire swing hanging from one of its lower branches. Valerie had planted hostas around its base. I'd spent countless Saturday mornings drinking coffee on our back deck, watching cardinals and blue jays argue over territory in its branches. It was, in the most literal sense, part of our home. Then Preston Carmichael moved in next door. Preston was maybe 55, recently divorced, and had purchased the house as part of what I can only describe as a midlife crisis property acquisition. He drove a leased BMW, wore golf shirts with the collars popped, and introduced himself by telling me how much he'd paid for his house, which was $485,000, as if I'd asked. "Nice place you've got here," he said during that first conversation, looking at my yard with an expression I now recognize as assessment rather than appreciation. "Lot of trees, though. Must be a pain to maintain." "We like trees," I said. "To each his own. I prefer a clean lawn myself, low maintenance, less hassle." I should have known then. The first complaint came about 6 weeks after he moved in. It was October, peak leaf dropping season, and Preston appeared at my door one Saturday morning while I was still in my bathrobe. "Hey, Derek, we need to talk about your tree." "Which tree?" "The big one in the back. The oak. It's dropping leaves into my yard." I waited for the rest. There wasn't any rest. "Okay," I said slowly. "It's autumn. Trees drop leaves." "Yeah, but they're dropping in my yard. I've had to rake twice this week already. Welcome to home ownership in a neighborhood with mature landscaping." He didn't appreciate that. His jaw tightened, and I watched him recalibrate. "Look, I'm not trying to start anything. I'm just saying that tree is on the property line, and the branches hang over into my space. Legally, I think I'm entitled to trim anything that crosses over. Feel free to trim what's over your property. That's your right. But the leaves are still going to fall. That's called nature, Preston. Don't be condescending." "I'm not. I'm explaining how deciduous trees work." He left in a huff. I went back to my coffee and didn't think much about it. The trimming started a week later. I came home from work to find Preston on a ladder with loppers, hacking at every branch that extended past what he considered the property line. He'd made a real mess of it too, cutting at odd angles, leaving jagged wounds that any arborist would tell you were invitations for disease. "Preston, what are you doing?" "Exercising my legal rights. Anything over my property line is fair game." "You're butchering that tree." "I'm maintaining my property." I bit back what I wanted to say and went inside. That night, I called a tree service and scheduled an inspection. The arborist, a guy named Martin who'd been in the business for 30 years, came out that weekend and spent 20 minutes examining the damage. "Your neighbor did this?" "Yeah." Martin shook his head. "He cut about 40% of the canopy on that side. See these angles? This is going to stress the tree significantly. You might see some dieback over the next few seasons." "Is there anything I can do?" "Not really. He's within his rights to trim what's over his property, even if he did it poorly. The tree will probably survive, but it's going to look lopsided for years." I thanked Martin and paid his consultation fee. Then I went inside and told Valerie what had happened. "He can't just destroy our tree," she said. "Technically, he didn't. He trimmed branches on his side. But look at it. It's ruined." "I know, but there's nothing we can do. This turned out to be incorrect." The winter passed without incident, mostly because there were no leaves to complain about. I saw Preston occasionally, and we exchanged the bare minimum of neighborly acknowledgement. Quick nods, brief waves, nothing approaching actual conversation. Then spring came, and the oak started leafing out again. The canopy was noticeably asymmetrical now, heavy on our side, sparse and scraggly on his. But it was still alive, still providing shade, still hosting the tire swing my kids loved. April brought a new complaint. "The roots," Preston said, appearing at my door again without warning. "The roots from your tree are messing with my lawn." "What do you mean?" "I've got bumps, uneven patches. My landscaper says it's because of the root system from that oak." "Trees have roots, Preston. They spread underground." "Not into my yard, they don't. I want you to do something about it." "There's nothing I can do. Roots grow where they grow." "Then maybe the tree needs to go." I laughed. Actually laughed. "That tree has been there for over 20 years. It's not going anywhere. We'll see about that." The next few weeks were tense but uneventful. Preston hired his own landscaper to do something about the root problem, which apparently involved cutting some of the surface roots along his side of the property line. Martin the arborist had warned me this could happen, and that significant root damage could destabilize the tree, but there wasn't much I could do about it legally. Then came May 17th. I remember the date because it was Valerie's birthday. We'd taken the day off work, sent the kids to school, and spent the morning doing absolutely nothing, which was the gift she'd requested. Around 11, we were sitting on the back deck with mimosas when we heard the chainsaw. At first I thought Preston was trimming something in his own yard. He had a few ornamental trees that needed occasional maintenance. But the sound was too close, too loud, too sustained. I walked around the side of the house to get a better view. Preston was standing in his yard with a chainsaw cutting into the trunk of our oak tree. Not trimming branches, cutting the trunk. For a moment I just stood there, unable to process what I was seeing. This man was destroying our tree, on our property, without permission, without warning, without any legal right whatsoever. "What the hell are you doing?" I shouted. Preston looked up, saw me, and kept cutting. I ran toward him, but by the time I reached the property line, the damage was done. The chainsaw had cut maybe 8 inches into the trunk from his side, a wound that Martin would later describe as fatal. The tree could survive the loss of branches. It could survive minor root damage. It could not survive having its vascular system severed. "It was dropping leaves in my yard," Preston said, shutting off the chainsaw with an expression of pure satisfaction. "Problem solved." "You just killed a tree that's been here for 20 years. Trees can be replaced. That tree was on my property. The branches hung over mine. I was protecting my investment." "You cut the trunk! The trunk is on my side of the property line! Prove it!" That's when I realized what he was doing. He'd planned this. He believed, probably correctly based on his general arrogance, that the property line was ambiguous enough that he could claim the tree was partially on his land. Most residential property lines aren't precisely marked. Fences and landscaping shift over decades. His bet was that I'd yell, threaten, maybe even call the police. And ultimately nothing would happen because who could really prove where one property ended and another began? "You're going to regret this," I said. "Is that a threat? It's a promise." I went inside and called a lawyer. Her name was Natalie Okonkwo, and she specialized in property disputes. I'd found her through a colleague at work whose brother had dealt with a similar boundary issue a few years back. She was expensive, $350 an hour, but after hearing my story, she seemed genuinely interested. "First thing we need is a professional survey. Do you have the original survey from when you purchased the property?" "Somewhere, probably. I'd have to dig through our files, find it, but we're going to want a new one anyway. If your neighbor is claiming any ambiguity about the property line, we need to establish it definitively." "What about the tree? Is there anything I can do about the tree?" "Potentially. In this state, you can sue for the value of the tree, which is calculated based on its age, species, and size. For a mature oak that's been growing for 20 years, we could be looking at significant damages. But we need to prove the tree was definitively on your property, which brings us back to the survey. I hired a surveyor named Douglas Brandt, who came out 3 days later with equipment that looked like it belonged on a movie set. He spent the better part of a morning taking measurements, consulting satellite images, and reviewing the legal description of my property. "Interesting situation you've got here," he said when he was finished. "How so?" "Well, the tree was definitely on your property, by about 4 feet. There's no ambiguity there. Good. What else?" Douglas hesitated. "Your neighbor's fence, the wooden privacy fence between your yards." "What about it?" "It's on your property, the entire thing." I stared at him. "What do you mean, the entire thing?" I mean, he built it or someone built it about 6 feet inside your property line. Every post, every panel, all of it is technically on land that belongs to you. I started laughing. I couldn't help it. Preston had killed my tree while standing on my property, behind a fence that was on my property, complaining about leaves that fell from a tree that was on my property. Can you put all this in a report? Already working on it. The survey report became Exhibit A in what would turn into a very expensive lawsuit for Preston Carmichael. Natalie filed the complaint 2 weeks later. We were suing for the value of the destroyed oak tree, which an arborist appraiser calculated at $8,400 based on species, size, and regional replacement costs. We were also suing for the cost of removing the dead tree safely, which was another $2,200. And we were demanding the removal of the encroaching fence, plus damages for years of unauthorized use of my property. Preston's response, delivered through his own attorney, was predictable: denial, counterclaims, and an attempt to shift blame. He claimed he'd believed in good faith that the tree was on or near the property line. He claimed the previous owners of his house had told him the fence was on the boundary. He claimed I had verbally agreed to let him trim the tree, which I absolutely had not. He even tried to countersue me for the cost of dealing with the leaves and roots, which Natalie said was legally creative but ultimately pointless. The discovery phase was brutal. Preston's attorney demanded records of every tree-related expense I'd ever had, trying to establish that I'd been a negligent property owner. We demanded records of when his fence was installed and by whom, which turned out to be a contractor hired by the previous owner who had apparently just eyeballed the property line rather than getting a survey. The deposition was where things got interesting. I sat across from Preston in a conference room at his attorney's office, watching him squirm as Natalie methodically walked him through his own decisions. Mr. Carmichael, you testified that you believed the oak tree was on or near the property line. What was that belief based on? I just assumed. It was close to the fence, and I figured the fence was the boundary. Did you ever request a survey to confirm this assumption? No. Did you ask the previous owner of your property about the boundary line? They mentioned the fence was the dividing line. That's what they told me. Do you have that in writing? No. So your decision to cut into the trunk of a 20-year-old oak tree was based on an unverified assumption and hearsay from a previous owner? I guess so, yeah. And you didn't think to consult with Mr. Thornton before taking this action? I'd talked to him before about the leaves. He wasn't interested in doing anything about it. Refusing to remove a healthy tree because your neighbor doesn't like leaves is different from authorizing the destruction of that tree, wouldn't you agree? Preston's attorney objected. Natalie moved on. The fence issue was even more damaging. Natalie had obtained records from the county showing that the fence had been installed in 2015 by a contractor who'd filed a permit, but apparently never had the work inspected. The permit described the fence as being along the property boundary, but the actual installation was 6 feet off. Mr. Carmichael, were you aware when you purchased your property that the fence encroached on your neighbor's land? No, I thought it was on the line. Did you request a survey before purchasing? No, the inspection didn't flag anything. A home inspection examines the structure, not the property boundaries. Isn't that correct? I guess so. So you purchased a property without verifying where it actually began and ended, then made assumptions about the boundaries, then destroyed a tree based on those assumptions. Is that an accurate summary? When you put it that way, I'm putting it the way the evidence supports, Mr. Carmichael. Settlement negotiations began in August. Preston's attorney reached out with an offer, $3,000 for the tree, no admission of wrongdoing, and we'd each maintain our current fence positions with a recorded easement. Natalie laughed when she told me about it. They want you to pay for a survey, pay for a lawsuit, and then let him keep the fence that's been on your property for almost a decade. What should we counter with? Full value of the tree, full cost of removal, and the fence comes down. If he wants to build a new fence on the actual property line, that's his prerogative and his expense. The counteroffer was rejected. Preston's attorney came back with $5,000 and a proposal to split the cost of moving the fence. We said no. Trial was scheduled for October. In the interim, I had the dead oak removed, which was genuinely sad. The tree service sent 4 guys and spent most of a day cutting it into sections and hauling it away. My kids cried. Valerie planted some flowers where the trunk had been. The backyard felt empty and wrong. Preston, meanwhile, seemed to be unraveling. I'd see him in his yard sometimes, staring at the fence, probably calculating what it was going to cost him to move it. His BMW disappeared, replaced by a Toyota Camry, which I later learned was because the lease payments had become untenable. Divorce, it turns out, is expensive, and lawyers are not cheap. The trial lasted 2 days. Day 1 was our case. The surveyor testified about the property lines. The arborist testified about the value of the tree and the extent of the damage. I testified about the sequence of events, the complaints, the warnings, and the moment I'd discovered Preston with a chainsaw. Day 2 was Preston's defense, which was basically, I didn't know, I didn't mean to, and everyone's overreacting. His attorney tried to argue that the tree had been a nuisance, that leaves and roots were causing genuine harm to Preston's property, and that his client had acted in what he believed to be his own legal rights. It didn't land well. The judge, a woman in her 60s who seemed deeply unimpressed by entitled behavior, kept asking pointed questions about why Preston hadn't verified the property line before taking destructive action. "Mr. Carmichael," she said at one point, "you're telling me you spent $485,000 on a house without ever confirming where your property actually ended?" "The fence seemed like a clear marker, Your Honor." "Fences get built in the wrong places all the time. That's why surveys exist." Preston had no good answer for that. The ruling came 3 weeks later. The judge found in our favor on all counts. Preston was ordered to pay $8,400 for the value of the destroyed oak tree, plus $2,200 for removal costs, plus an additional $4,400 in damages for the years of fence encroachment, calculated at $400 per year since 2015, plus our legal fees, which came to just over $6,000. Total, approximately $21,000. Additionally, Preston was ordered to remove the encroaching fence within 60 days or face additional penalties. The day the ruling was delivered, Preston showed up at my door. He looked terrible, grey-faced and hollow-eyed, like he hadn't slept in weeks. "You've ruined me," he said. "You ruined yourself. I just documented it. I can't afford this. I'm going to have to sell the house." "That sounds like a personal problem." "You could have just talked to me. We could have worked something out." "I did talk to you multiple times. You ignored me and cut down my tree anyway." "It was dropping leaves." "Trees drop leaves, Preston. That's what they do. You didn't have to take it this far. You took it this far when you decided a chainsaw was an appropriate solution to a minor seasonal inconvenience." He stood there for a moment, mouth opening and closing like he wanted to say something but couldn't find the words. Then he turned and walked back to his house. The fence came down in November. Preston hired a crew to dismantle it, and I watched from my back deck as they pulled up posts and stacked panels. It took most of a day. When they were done, there was just bare dirt and post holes where the boundary had been incorrectly marked for years. Preston built a new fence in December, this time on the actual property line, confirmed by his own surveyor. It was cheaper than the original chain link instead of wood privacy panels, and it looked terrible next to my yard. But it was on his property, so I couldn't complain. He put his house on the market in January. The listing price was $450,000, $35,000 less than he'd paid, and even then it sat for 2 months before he accepted an offer of $425,000. Between that loss, the lawsuit damages, and his divorce settlement, I'm guessing Preston Carmichael's midlife crisis property investment cost him somewhere in the neighborhood of $80,000. The new neighbors are a young couple named Qley and Tracy with a toddler and a dog. They introduced themselves the week after they moved in, brought over cookies, and asked if I minded if they planted some fruit trees along the back of their lot. "Plant whatever you want," I said. "Just keep it on your property." "Of course, we're not monsters," we laughed. It felt good. I planted a new oak tree in the spring. It's just a sapling now, maybe 6 feet tall, thin and fragile compared to the giant that used to be there. The arborist says it'll take at least 15 years before it provides any real shade, probably 20 before it looks like anything substantial. I'll be in my 60s by then. My kids will be grown. Valerie and I will probably be talking about downsizing, moving somewhere warmer, escaping the winters that seem to get longer every year. But maybe we'll still be here. Maybe I'll sit on the back deck with my morning coffee and watch birds argue in the branches of a tree that I planted, that I protected, that I fought for. Preston Carmichael thought he could solve his problems by cutting down anything that inconvenienced him. What he learned, expensively, is that actions have consequences, property lines matter, and some things, once destroyed, can never truly be replaced. The tire swing is gone now, there's nothing to hang it from. But my daughter, who's 11 now, Sometimes walks over to where the old oak stood and touches the flowers Valerie planted there. "I miss that tree," she said last week. "Me too, kiddo." Why did the mean man cut it down? Because he thought his comfort was more important than everything else. That's dumb. Yeah, I said, it really was.